Welcome to the new first episode of the Lucid Truth podcast, Metaphysics and Science. The original first episode, The Needle of Controversy, is still posted, but it isn't a great introduction to the kinds of discussions and topics that are central to this show. This new pilot, Metaphysics and Science, was chosen because it is my very first online debate, and it covers ideas central to the Lucid Truth, such as consciousness, science, philosophy, and psychedelics. While you can see echoes of this conversation in the podcast, you will also hear evolutions, as my ideas since this discussion have changed in some important ways. I still take an interest in metaphysics and parapsychology. However, I'm going for a more scientific and skeptical approach. This conversation is with a friend of mine, Ryan Price, who has more discussions between us available on my YouTube channel, The Lucid Truth, under the Interviews section. But this is by far the most interesting discussion we've had. So, get ready for the new official introduction to the Lucid Truth podcast, Metaphysics and Science, with Ryan Price and Isaac Lindenberger. Oh, and one last thing. My apologies on the audio quality. This was actually the first online discussion I've ever had, so it gets better, I promise. Back to the show.
All right, I am Ryan Price, and I am here with Isaac. And Isaac, please introduce yourself.
My interest, Ryan, and what me and Ryan are going to be discussing in this video is going to be related to primarily the nature of consciousness and whether or not it exists at a local or a non-local level and derivatives of that kind of concept. So we were on Facebook together. Was it Tyler's post, right?
Yes. Yeah, Tyler.
I posted a picture. What was his original post?
Something about how like you are the universe and experiencing itself in an infinite amount of ways or something like that. Just a generic meme.
Right, yeah. He posted something like that. It was like a nice little meme. And I commented something about as above, so below, which is basically like it showed a cell splitting and the universe, a universe splitting, like a star dividing. And then it showed a eye and it showed a galaxy. And then it showed a brain network, and it showed a universe grid, a map of a universal grid. And it showed how they're comparable. And I said, as above, so below.
Yeah, I vastly disagree with that concept and think it's been disproven by the existence of certain scientific theories. And so I essentially posted that pareidolia is the name of the experience where you see something and you think you know what it is just because of how it looks, and that's enough for you. You decide what it is. And so that's how I explained it away. And then we started having this disagreement that seemed more like you weren't disagreeing with me, but I still felt like you were disagreeing with me. So essentially I offered to do this to get to the bottom of what is exactly we're disagreeing on, because it seems like I hold a very different view from you. Yet we never seem to disagree as soon as I say that, well, what about these facts? And you say, what about these facts? And no one disagrees about what the facts are so far. So it's interesting to see what the actual disagreement even is.
Right, because I think the disagreement lies in our interpretation of the facts. So my point in saying the as above, so below was it was analogous to it was a metaphor. It was basically saying like we are part of the universe at a macrocosmic and microcosmic scale, and that can be seen in many facets of life. Because, in my opinion, I love science, don't get me wrong. It's an evolutionary milestone. That's even, not giving it enough credit in the advance of human society. And that's not something I want to argue against. But I am concerned about what intense scientism can lead to, which, as Friedrich Nietzsche put in the 17th century, that it could lead to nihilism and the deprivation of moral values from society. Because I think that nihilism, even though not all scientists are nihilists, I just think a lot of science can lead to it. So that's not a given right away. But nihilism is like the escape of moral responsibility. You can do whatever you want because everything is subjectively true that you perceive it as, at least related to morals. But it's at the cost of virtual hopelessness. But then again, I think Nietzsche did lose his mind when he went up to a horse and grabbed it by its mare and said, "I understand you," and shook it around. So maybe he's not the best person to decide in this kind of thing. But I do love science, but I don't think it comes without its drawbacks also.
Well, okay, so I would say that science is definitely not the god of facts, like some people treat it like it is. It's not if something is science, then automatically it's true forever, because that's not what science means.
Right. Science doesn't even say that in all reality.
Right, exactly. So that's not really a criticism against science. It's a mischaracterization of it. So the actual disagreement that I have with things like as above, so below, I understand it as a metaphor in terms of things like we are emergent natural phenomena. That I agree with. That's evident. But if the phrase as above, so below is true, then as we go down, we should see things that function like galaxies, but we don't. We see things that function like quantum mechanics. And as we go up, we never see anything that functions like quantum mechanics. It never happens that way. So and just an evidence-based scale, emergent properties are just the result of their fundamental underlying components. So that's not, in that sense, as above, so below, definitely. But in terms of what's really going on, a nebula is nothing like an eye. A nebula is nothing like cells dividing. Those are very, very, very different things. And the fact that we can make them appear to be the same is kind of irrelevant.
I would say that that's true, that it's more of coincidental than synchronistic, like Carl Jung put it. But I would say that the point that we're fundamentally disagreeing on is related to the nature of consciousness, because if consciousness is a quantum process and it actually takes place as a receiver of the brain rather than a product of brain function, then I think we would have evidence that the disparities that lie within our disagreements are actually valid in terms of how we both view consciousness. So, like before, to actually discuss our disagreement on consciousness, we have to get to the point of what consciousness actually is. So, what would you describe consciousness as?
I don't actually have I don't know if I have a functioning definition of consciousness, but I know of a few models that I sort of combine into one thing. So my best understanding of consciousness is to stop explaining it as awareness and to instead explain it as a continued set of reactions that happened. It's like a lag. So I explained it to one of my friends the other day as a speaker vibrates because of an electric signal that is sent to it, which vibrates the air, which vibrates your ear, which recreates a new electric signal, which then is processed as sound, and then eventually you hear it as sound. By the time you're hearing that sound, the speaker is already playing a different sound. Let's say if you're listening to music. So there's this lag of what you think is happening now is technically happening now in terms of consciousness is this true lag. But I think that it happens so that certain things that would usually happen too fast in your brain have a chance to slow down and have the ability to communicate with each other. And so then you can flip back and forth between whether you should be paying attention or verbalizing something or a few other things, like just things that your consciousness is capable of redirecting things towards. So consciousness is, I guess I shouldn't use the word consciousness as a part of the definition, but it's a lag where there's no extra phenomena going on. It's just that normally phenomena don't interact like this. So it appears different because we want to describe it as different.
Right. So you would say that consciousness is a product of the brain, right? And the brain created consciousness and it didn't exist before humans, right? And it's localized within the brain. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. So the reason that I think that it's a product of the brain and it's not being received by the brain is because in order for me to believe that it's being received by the brain, doing damage to people's brains or like killing them or anything should just free them of everything and they'll just go on forever just fine. But that doesn't seem to be what happens. So I have to believe that the physical reality is essentially an inverted representation of what consciousness really is in order to believe that it's a receiver.
Okay, so I can understand that. So I think I align with this theory. It's called orchestrated objective reduction, and it was proposed by Roger Penrose, who's a quantum physician and a microbiologist and all this stuff. And basically his theory is that consciousness is contained within microtubule fibers in the brain that are isolated, and these benzene rings that exist within the microtubule fibers are superimposed with each other, and they're quantumly entangled. So if consciousness is received by these microtubules, then damaging the brain would damage the parts of the brain that receive consciousness and could lead to the observed diminished capabilities of somebody's cognitive function in terms of their brain damage and how it would relate to the conscious reception. So the way that his theory works is that human consciousness is created by the collapse of the quantum wave function. And so the entanglement that happens is collapsed through the actual microtubule reception in the brain, and that's what leads to the reception of consciousness within individuals. So it's pretty solid evidence right now, but it's not proven yet, and they're working on some more experiments to prove it. But Roger Penrose, I mean, that guy is a genius. I wish I understood quantum physics as much as he does, but it's a nice anatomical theory that promotes how consciousness could be received by the brain.
Yeah, so I only wonder, how does quantum entanglement cause consciousness if quantum entanglement can't occur at the scale of anything so quantum entanglement, for anybody who doesn't already know, is the phenomena where two particles can seemingly communicate information about themselves without having to traverse the space between them at all. It just happens instantaneously. And it's not that they're predetermined things that we just discover later. It's that they are indeterminate until they are measured to be a specific determined property. And then seemingly instantaneously, the other particle will just know how to be its inverted pair. So I'm not sure how that will allow for awareness. Is there any way that you could extrapolate on how that's even, like, how do you get from that phenomena to awareness?
So I think that the way that it works is, so consciousness exists outside of the human body as a phenomenon of the physical universe, right? Or maybe other dimensional landscapes that contain consciousness interacting with our dimensional plane. But just to keep it for the sake of being the most realistic as possible, let's say that consciousness is a function of our universe contained within itself. So consciousness exists at a universal level, like energy, like gravity or something like that. And it's received through these microtubule fibers in a form where the quantum entanglement represents the inside of the human brain being linked to processes that exist outside of the human brain in terms of the universe. And so this fractal geometry of consciousness, which makes a lot of sense when you think about what psychedelics can do to an individual, links the person with the objective consciousness that exists outside of themselves, kind of like collective consciousness, like Jung's work. So the quantum entanglement is part of the merging between the inside of the human brain and the outside of the human brain, where consciousness is non-local. So I think the evidence promotes the non-locality of consciousness being received by these microtubules in a quantum way, shows how it can be non-local and how that can affect thought directly as a form of a reception. And I'm not sure if that answered your question.
It partially answers my question. It just leads me to another question instead. So you have the entanglement is essentially you're entangling, we'll say, two particles, because that's the most simple form of entanglement. And one of those particles has to be in your brain, and another one of those particles has to be outside of your brain.
Yes.
Okay. So in order for that to be true, both of those particles have had to have interacted before in the past of the universe in order to become entangled to begin with.
Right, and that would make sense considering the singularity and the Big Bang and all that stuff.
Well, there weren't any particles at singularities or in the Big Bang. I don't think that those are coherent concepts at that scale. But
well, the way I always thought of it was relativity and quantum mechanics were both operating within the singularity that caused the Big Bang. So relativity and quantum mechanics weren't separate or disparate entities; they were kind of merged, and that would
Right.
explain
But
how
I
they
don't
would
actually.
be named after.
I'm sorry, but I actually don't know what that would mean, so I don't know if that's possible. That's the issue with
Yeah.
that.
Then again, no one knows how singularities work, so that's kind
Right.
of conjectural at that point. So you
Right.
were
So
saying that they'd have to be interacting before.
yeah. So essentially the only other issue with the fact that they have to interact before they ever enter your brain. So it's just a total coincidence that your brain has that particle. Also, all the known matter exists in this dimension. It is not possible for consciousness to be in another dimension and it to be interacting with a particle that was in this universe.
I don't think that's true. If it was a quantum process, it could be linking through different dimensions.
How do we get to there? How is that indicated?
So I think the biggest evidence for that, I'm not sure what the actual evidence is in quantum physics, but in terms of psychedelics, I think that they do link to that theory that consciousness is related to an existence that's outside of the human brain. So that's where the evidence comes into play of tryptophan, right? So as you all know, tryptophan is an amino acid, and amino acids build proteins. And everything that's alive has protein in it. Otherwise, if you don't have protein, you ain't alive. So one of the properties of life is containing protein. It has to be there. So tryptophan is in all life. It's an essential amino acid. And DMT is derived 2 steps from tryptophan. So DMT hasn't been found in all life, but it's in most life. I think we could make the claim that it's been found in all life that's considered conscious. So I think that DMT could be the link between consciousness in another dimension and consciousness in our brains, kind of like how the microtubule fibers relate to consciousness being at a quantum level. So I can get more into DMT in a second, but I'll let you respond to that.
All right. So I don't know what to call it, my skeptical part of my brain wants to flag a few things. The one thing that I want to flag is that quantum mechanics doesn't exactly work like it seems like you want it to with entanglement still. Like that still is a kind of a unresolved issue with your theory a little bit. Also, you're using terms like, okay, so consciousness, which is obviously the mystery we're trying to get a little bit closer to the bottom of. You're using a term, another dimension, which is essentially, I'm assuming, an unprobable place other than through unconventional meanings. And quantum mechanics, you're using specific parts of quantum mechanics that seem to, I'm assuming that you think that probability means that things are not deterministic, but that's a misunderstanding of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So,
that's definitely a misunderstanding of his principle. A lot of people actually take it to that level where they say, oh, science doesn't know anything because they can't be sure of anything because of the uncertainty principle. No, that's not what the uncertainty principle is actually trying to say. It's just saying that we can't be certain of whether or not it is something if we observe it or observation is interacting with it.
yeah, the uncertainty principle means that whatever property you're going to measure, you can't actually know what you're going to measure until it's measured.
Right.
And you can't even know it by measuring it before. There's this probability, and that probability is described by wave functions.
That's why electrons are in clouds, and that's why it's where the electron is most likely to lie in a specific cloud, because they don't know an electron's here. This probably is in this area, less likely to be in this area, no chance of being in one area, that kind of thing.
So that's where I think that I think you're getting it just a little bit wrong. I think that from my understanding, and I'm not a physicist, so I could be corrected on this too, but from my understanding, the whole cloud of probability, like all the places that the electron can be, that is the real electron. The real entity that is the electron is the entire cloud at once. But when interacted with, it behaves as a particle according to us as other particles interacting with it. And so that has to do with, from my understanding, energy and how high frequency things are. And once you get down to having no mass and having tiny sized particles moving very quickly, then you're no longer have such a high energy to be. I'm not a physicist. I'm just saying that your physics doesn't add up to me. I don't know. I don't want you to go ahead on
Well,
this.
that's true though, because okay, so there's the practicality of the electron's location, and there's the hypothetical level of where it is. So hypothetically, the whole cloud or the whole shell, orbital, however you want to call it, mainly orbitals is how p shell, s shell, all that stuff.
Mhm.
Mainly in orbitals of an electron's location. Hypothetically, the whole orbital, and those things can look crazy when you get into like the F ring, they're like going through each other. But
Yeah.
is the whole electron. But practically, in terms of chemical reactions and how things are actually going to physically merge together,
Okay.
the probable location of the electron does matter in a practical sense, even though hypothetically the whole thing could be considered an electron.
Yeah. Okay. So then that concept, I totally agree with everything you just said. That is my understanding of why we can't do quantum entanglement the way you want to. Because in order for something to behave like two entangled particles, they essentially have to go back to a point where they are experiencing the same event, and that is what entangles them. That event, but pre that event, they don't have those properties, and so it seems like you want there to be some sort of preconditioned consciousness, and then that consciousness comes into play at the point of the human brain somehow, and also through these entangled particles, but it just exists anyway without all of that. So I don't even understand how is this all supposed to piece together, given that it
Okay.
doesn't seem like you can get going.
So basically, I think that consciousness existed before humans accessed it. And when consciousness was all kind of merged, that's where the interactions of the quantum particles would have taken place to the point that they could entangle after they're received by the human mind, and then it still exists outside of us. So consciousness isn't the creation of the human mind, it's a product of it. So in this form, so earlier I mentioned how psychedelic tryptamines like DMT are in all life. So then we can get back to the origin of consciousness itself to kind of explain this. So Huxley, he promoted the theory of neurotheology, which basically states that early humans took psychedelic plants, they used it to expand their consciousness, and that's why humans are like they are, because we have consciousness developed through that. And this goes all the way back to the Rig Veda, the oldest religious text. They talk about the soma, which was a psychedelic beverage of mushrooms. And then manna in the Bible is very commonly considered to be a mushroom. Not proven or anything, but very highly conjectured. And a lot of people attribute this theory to Terence McKenna with the Stoned Ape theory, but really it was Huxley with neurotheology. So if psychedelic entheogens, an entheogen, for anyone that doesn't know, en is the Latin for within, and theo is theology. So an entheogen generates the divine within. It's a nice term for a spiritual psychedelic. If entheogens developed the ability for humans to adapt to the point where they could receive consciousness and they could access it, then entheogens are the best tool that we have to probe what lies within the deeper levels of consciousness itself. So, since consciousness existed before humans ever existed, it's like within the fabric of the structure of the universe, then we can use entheogens to further analyze how consciousness can be accessed by humans and how it could be investigated empirically. But basically, I would say that consciousness did exist before humans. Entheogens allowed us to receive it. And then after we received it, that's where the quantum entanglement comes from, because it was already kind of connected within itself. And then entheogens are what connected it to the human brain. And then it interacted like that.
Okay, so then the next couple questions that I wonder is it possible that you're just personifying consciousness and that's why you think it exists before humans? Like, so you said before humans accessed it, which I get from your point of view, it was already there, but that's a strong claim that there was like humans that didn't access it, or that there are animals. Like, essentially it implies that animals aren't the same, or some animals who eat some mushrooms are conscious but other ones aren't, or they are significantly impaired consciously because they haven't eaten mushrooms.
Definitely.
And also, sorry, one other question is, how did the entheogens evolve to give us consciousness? Like,
Okay.
Doesn't that imply that there's like some sort of direction to evolution?
Okay, yes. So here's what I would say with that. So basically, with the first question with animals, I definitely think that humans weren't necessarily humans before they actually were able to develop consciousness. They were like not subhuman, but not fully human yet. And there are levels of consciousness that exist without psychedelics. I mean, animals are, and plants even, are to a degree conscious. But what accelerated the ability to access more consciousness, greater depths of it, was these entheogens. So basically, I think that these entheogens accelerated the development of us being able to access consciousness. It might have happened over a much longer period of time without any entheogens. They just rapidly accelerated that process.
What do you think about what do you think makes an entheogen have this property? What is it that you're proposing?
Okay, so how an entheogen actually accesses consciousness is basically an entheogen is a biochemical link to what consciousness actually is, and that's why they exist. So when we look to get more into this, we can go into, all right, so humans that are blinded, right, when they lose their vision, they can develop echolocation. They ping stuff with their tongue, and then they can find where it is. There's this guy who's totally blind. He can bike through New York, completely heavy traffic, and he's fine because of this echolocation. But it's not normally a function that's accessible to the human brain unless it's impaired, and then it compensates for it. So obviously there are bugs that can see a lot of colors that we can't normally see, animals that have the ability to tune into different frequencies. Our brain was created to observe the material plane, our material dimension, and interact with it so we could survive and live, right? So basically, I think that there are other frequencies or higher dimensional planes of information that we can access with our brain. It's like a radio, like a tuning thing. And if we tune it with entheogens, then we're actually able to access these higher dimensional states of being, and then we can take information from them. They're always there. We're just not regularly tuned into them, kind of like a radio. And then we use these entheogens to access that. And then there is evidence to their consistency that this is actually an objective place.
So just to be clear, we're talking entheogens as in the molecule that causes the actual effect and not the entire like mushroom, not the whole organism of the mushroom is not the entheogen, right? It's the psilocybin.
And even just the extracted chemical would do the job. So the way that it actually expands your consciousness is through interacting with your serotonin receptors, 5-HT2A receptors. So how the actual biochemistry expands your perception, that's like a function of biochemistry. And there is some interesting theories into how it actually happens. But the point isn't necessarily how it biochemically activates. So I was actually listening to a talk the other day, and it was talking about how most conventional people who believe in evolution believe that humans reproduced to persist. You know, reproduction was driven by the wanting of your species to live or whatever, you know, to reproduce. That's what drove it. Well, basically, the quantum theory of accessing consciousness, the reason why consciousness even was accessible in the first place was basically so that we would evolve to the point where we could actually feel the desire to do that. And that's what consciousness came into play in terms of emotional processing. So it wasn't necessarily, it actually was the drive of evolution to access consciousness. If we couldn't access consciousness, then there would be no drive to evolve in the first place because we couldn't understand or feel or interpret those life processes. And so I think that's where entheogens come into play too. Now, there's a lot of people that think that entheogens are extra dimensional probes, like Terence McKenna says something about this, like mushrooms. You know, you've seen Ancient Aliens, right? With the History Channel buffs. Like, here's historical accuracy. I'm the History Channel, right? Here's historical accuracy, and here's aliens. And aliens is cocaine, and historical accuracy is like water. And I'm just aliens, you know, historical accuracy is out the window, and that's the History Channel for you. But they have this thing where they talk about how these drawings, these cave drawings, are evidence that extraterrestrials came here because they're really trippy. They've got like space things and people that look like aliens talking to you. Well, in those areas, there's actually a higher number of natural entheogens around. So it's likely that they just drew their experiences on the entheogens and drew their trips basically that were from the plants that were really abundant in those areas. And it wasn't actually an alien experience, but it still could have been multidimensional, right? They could have still interacted with a being that exists in another dimension by expanding their consciousness to the point that they could perceive that dimensional plane and then interact with whatever lived there and then drawing the experience through an interior realm to outer space rather than an exterior one. I think it's much more likely.
Okay. I have alternative explanations, but first we're going to stick with the questioning your theory. So essentially, from the biggest red flag left for me is that I think that you said, you can correct me if this is not what you meant, that entheogens, the point of their evolution, and therefore the point of human evolution and evolution in general, all the way up to this point, is to interpret and to feel, to be able to be aware of the world. Like consciousness is essentially the point of existence, which would be the point of the solar system forming. And so it's like you think it's steering everything, right?
Kind of. I don't think it's necessarily placenta. I don't think it, I don't think it explains everything. I think that is getting to the point of being zealous. I think that that consciousness was one of the evolutionary driving forces of evolution. I don't think it was the only one. I think it was probably the main one, but there were definitely other factors involved in that.
So from my understanding, natural selection, just what kills what will die because of what, and random mutations is sufficient to explain everything that we've observed in biodiversity so far without anything having to be aware of what's happening. Like just unconscious death is good enough. So doesn't that kind of undermine the need for consciousness to drive evolution?
In all technicality, that could explain it, right? That evolution could be explained outside of the context of consciousness. It's definitely possible. But when we interact with conscious phenomenon to the point to where we see personally through interpersonal experience and subjectivity that it has these intense properties of like connecting you to the whole universe, connecting you to yourself, I think that it makes sense that it had more to do with evolutionary development than a lot of people give it credit for. Because also, if you can't become aware, then evolution is kind of like, it's kind of cut off to the point to where, things are going to be able to develop to the point that they did without consciousness. And that's why I think, not why I think it's an intrinsic property of the universe, but one of the reasons I think it is. And so one of the things that give evidence that it's non-local is showing that consciousness can physically affect material reality. You ever hear about the water experiment? Turns out it was actually bogus. It's been debunked already. Dr. Emoto from Japan was the one who did the research. Have you heard of it?
I have not.
Basically, the theory, this experiment, it was interesting. I wanted to believe it. At first, I did. I told people like, "Hey, check this out. It's great." Turns out I was totally wrong. You got to read the reports before you spread the propaganda, But anyway, so I watched I watched the video, and it said that there was this experiment where they had water molecules, right? And they sent it love. Like, I love you, water molecule. And they had other ones, and they sent it hate. Like, you're the worst water molecule ever. And then the ones that were sent love looked beautiful and symmetric, and the ones that were sent hate looked disgusting and ugly. Well, it turns out he picked out which ones looked ugly and beautiful for himself. Right. And then when it was given an objective analysis that was non-biased, there was no determined differences. So while I would love to believe that experiment was true, it was hosh-posh pseudoscience. So I can't reference it any longer. Feel bad for all the people I told that to. But there are experiments that do show that exists. I'll tell you about that in a second.
All right. So essentially, I'm really struggling with you seem to be implying that evolution has a goal. And that its goal is to allow things to be experienced with as much awe and intensity as possible, even if for billions of years nothing ever has and things were getting by fine.
Maybe it wasn't a goal, but maybe it's one of the things that drove it after it experienced that for itself. Like one of the driving forces, like the developmental factors.
Okay.
Might not have been before. through any
So
agent
then,
after.
couldn't we draw the same thing with, we'll say, a snake venom? Snake venom didn't exist until it existed, or whatever. Maybe there's some sort of evolution to it I don't understand. But whenever the venom itself existed, venom was not out there in the universe waiting to exist, and then finally snakes appeared and it had a place to start happening. It's that
Right.
venom was very beneficial once it was arranged in such a way that that's how it works. But that doesn't mean that something else is coming into the picture. And couldn't consciousness just work the same way?
Of course it could. That's possible. So I think that the evidence from specifically psychedelics, but also through some anatomical theories, shows that that wasn't the case. And if it was the case, consciousness didn't develop. If it was developed by humans, which is possible and didn't exist before the universe actually created, then your theory would be right, and it would pretty much be localized to the brain. But if you can show that consciousness is non-local and existed outside of the universe in the first place, then you would show that it was humans developed, or animals or life developed to access it. And that's one of the properties that catalyze the development of life itself. So there is other evidence that shows that consciousness is non-local, other than the orchestrated objective reduction theory. There's more that I can get into about psychedelics. So like I said earlier about the other dimensions and stuff being accessible through the mind, and like kind of like frequencies like a radio tuner, there's evidence that shows that this is probably the main form of evidence I have. You've probably heard of the third eye before, right? Like, you want to decalcify, bro. Turns out your pineal gland calcifies naturally. So trying to decalcify your pineal gland is like trying to decalcify your bones. So it's like a common misconception in the community that I affiliate with. They're always trying to decalcify something that naturally calcifies. But anyway, the pineal gland isn't even your third eye, actually. It's not the seat of the soul, like Descartes put it in the 17th century. Interestingly though, the Tibetan Book of the Dead said that the soul forms after 4 weeks, right? Well, the pineal gland actually forms after a month. So if it is the seat of the soul, that would be ancient wisdom being proven by current science. Even though I don't buy it, it's plausible. And anyway, so near-death experiences, right? This is where we get the main evidence that consciousness is non-local. Near-death experiences are common when people encounter something that almost kills them. They leave their body, go to another dimension, interact with entities that tell them the truth about the nature of the universe, see machinery that controls the operational functions of reality, interact with beings that have infinite information stored within them. They feel like a caveman in a computer lab. And they come back and they're like, what the heck? That's near-death experiences, right? Well, DMT does the same thing. When Rick Strassman did research in the 90s, he gave people intravenous injections of DMT. And when he did that, they had a near-death experience, same exact thing, other dimension, aliens, or beings, all that stuff. And they came back and he was like, oh yeah, that was just a hallucination. And they're like, that was the most real thing I've ever seen. And he's like, what? This is getting weird. So the correlation between near-death experiences and DMT experiences are phenomenal. And there was actually just an article released in Frontiers of Neuropsychology, which is a very famous article series. It has a journal index citation ranking of like 4, which means it's cited all the time. And they showed how DMT replicates the near-death experience, how they're almost literally the same in a great peer-reviewed journal. And one could make the argument, oh, well, if DMT produces near-death experiences, like everyone thinks that is what happens. People think that DMT causes near-death experiences. If DMT causes near-death experiences in the brain, and you get that effect from smoking it, well, it's just activating the same part of the brain. That's why it's consistent, Otherwise, it wouldn't be interesting. Well, it is interesting anyway. So it turns out they're wrong. DMT is not released during near-death experiences. If it was, that would discredit my theory, because that would mean that, like, let's say it's the hippocampus, right? Near-death experiences activate the hippocampus, and DMT activates the hippocampus. So no wonder you experience the same thing. Of course, they're going to be similar. Turns out near-death experiences are caused by kappa opioid receptors and glutamate interacting through asphyxiation. And so that is the cause of near-death experiences in transcendental states from that. And since they're caused by different brain activation sites, but they lead to the same objective experience, that gives evidence that it's actually a real dimension.
Okay. Obviously I take problem with that. I think that so I've done my fair share of psychedelics. I know exactly what it is like to feel that was more real than real feeling.
Mhm.
And like I've also taken psychedelics and known that I was just hallucinating. And so it definitely feels different. Like what people are calling a breakthrough feels different than just tripping. It feels different than just being weirded out and things kind of trailing off and the weirdness that happens. It feels like you're in a totally different landscape.
Right.
But in order to say that that's evidence for another dimension, you have to rule out ways that it could be explained in these dimensions. And the current way that I think you could explain all of that is the human mind automatically experiences awe. It's a super intense amount of wonder at the universe and just existence itself. So much wonder that it can't take it. So it actually doesn't want to wonder why it exists. It doesn't want to feel the existential crisis of being aware of death and all of these things that come with being a person. So we distract ourselves from it. And in the process of distracting ourselves from it, we get caught up in the instant gratification that gives us. And so we end up allowing that to control our lives, and we get swept away trying to distract ourselves with things. Certain things like meditation or psychedelics will force you to become more mindful. And when you're more mindful, it's just the exact same as being the opposite of distracted. And so I think that you are re-experiencing the wonder you already have, but that you keep yourself distracted from because it's overwhelming when you're sober. It's overwhelming when you're thinking about the darker aspects of reality. And that would explain where all of everything comes from. It would allow you to be hallucinating all of the details of everything. It would still be a phenomena of the brain, and no extra dimensions are needed. No extra physiology is needed. No extra biology is needed. No extra explanations for evolution is needed. No extra explanations for how near-death experiences are similar to DMT, because it's all about losing the distractions. Anything that accomplishes losing the distractions is going to give you the same effect. It doesn't matter if it's psychedelics. It doesn't matter if you're almost dying. It doesn't matter if you're meditating. It's going to give you this feeling of I'm at peace. And the reason that psychedelics don't always lead you there towards the peace is because I don't think you always let go of the distractions. And so sometimes you feel the intensity of the wonder of the universe while on psychedelics, but you're forced into this hell of you want to distract yourself from the intensity that's going on. And if you don't let go of that, then you just get stuck in it. So even when you're having a bad trip, I still think that the intensity of the trip comes from how distracted you're not. And the problem is coming from that you still are a little. And that would explain everything without adding any sort of extra physics.
So I really love that theory. I think it's very interesting and well thought out. And I wonder almost if, say that this theory is totally right, well, I don't think it would discredit my theory at all. Because if you have a brain that's distracted infinitely from the reality of the universe and you undistract it, then would they be hallucinations, or would they be the brain's natural processing of reality? And that's what these dimensions are. They're the natural intrinsic nature and function of the universe being seen in undistracted perspective and not hallucinations.
Okay, so I don't think that it's I don't think you did this on purpose, but I think it's an unfair representation of what I'm trying to say that you're distracted from the universe. Everything, even every distraction is real and it's happening in real time. What's important about distractions is that they are routine and they are non-challenging. So it's not that you're focusing on things that are distractions from the real world. It's that you're only willing to look at the parts of the real world that feel routine or non-challenging. And when you want to hold on to those things, reality doesn't let you. Like, you're going to get hungry again, and that's not a good feeling. And all of your friends are going to die before you do, or you're going to die before all of your friends do. And there's really no way out of it. So there's just like all these realities are not pleasant to know about. And so I don't think that people are distracting themselves from the real world. I think they're just creating a very narrow bandwidth of what information is allowed in. And so it's still that everything is here right now, and it's actually being produced here right now. But it's that we have such an affinity for avoiding pain that we misapprehend what it feels like to go for our first week of running as a problem. And if you go running for a week, it's going to feel like a problem, but you're actually getting yourself in shape. And so we're confusing the problem, which is how everybody's thinking, and the solution, which is finding a way to expand your consciousness. And we're confusing that with it has to be this esoteric, magical thing. It doesn't have to be esoteric and magical. It could just be a series of endless reactions, one of which is kind of laggy, and that's what we're calling consciousness. And we're just noticing things as it appears in there and picking and choosing whether we want to verbalize it or whether we want to pay closer attention to it or how we want to handle what's coming in. And that's where the distractions come in. So you actually can't distract yourself from the real world because you are the real world distracting itself from itself. And that doesn't really make sense. But you can distract yourself from massive amounts of information that are real. So that way you can believe what you want.
So since this is relevant, since you were talking about being part of the universe and the distraction thing, well, how I view it is, say you have infinity, right, all in one thing, or say consciousness is this infinite thing, right? How are you going to process that as infinity? It's going to be pretty damn hard, I would think. So if you fragment your consciousness into individualized subunits, like humans or animals, then they can experience yourself through yourself as yourself. I think that's why we exist, to receive consciousness, so that we can take it and observe it for it, because it couldn't do it on its own. And that's why I think consciousness, it has no agency. So a lot of people say, well, if God is real, why doesn't he if he's omnipotent, why doesn't he stop all this suffering? Well, what if God is not omnipotent? What if God doesn't have agency and directive, can't just flick his finger and do whatever he wants? Or even if we're going to call it God, I still like to stick with the term consciousness. Maybe it doesn't have, I don't think it has agency like that. I think that it is a natural phenomenon, a process that expands through the universe, and then we luckily were able to receive it, and that's one of the driving forces of evolution. And then we can't experience it because it couldn't do it on its own. And it's lucky it has us, or something like that. Sounds a little egotistical, but it's not. It's kind of the opposite. But what you were saying, can you remind me what the poetic naturalism was? Because I remember I really liked that theory.
Yeah, so poetic naturalism is Sean Carroll's new way of describing. So naturalists very often are labeled materialists, as in they're people who believe that atoms exist and that's it. And of course, everybody knows that not just atoms exist. So that's
right.
An absurd point of view. Sean Carroll is a quantum physicist. I think he's a cosmologist. I don't actually know which one of those. I think he calls himself a particle physicist. But regardless, his theory is that naturalism, in terms of that, the material world and dark matter and dark energy and the space-time, that's really all that exists. That really is all that exists. But the poetic part of poetic naturalism is that things like free will, though they don't exist, are useful things to talk about. They're useful ways of describing things. And so they exist in a sort of like a subcategory of existence, which is more than not existing at all. So it's not fair to say that things don't have free will from his point of view, but it's also not, it's not because there's anything that actually makes any free decisions. It's that free will is an emergent way of describing the way things are behaving. It doesn't mean that that's an actually fundamental part of nature. So he's both willing to accept the naturalism part of nature, where nature is everything and that's it. And the poetic part of poetic naturalism is being willing to accept that those things are really having relationships with each other. And you can describe how those relationships are behaving without saying that that is an actual object in reality.
Interesting. So would you say that that's similar to how you left your pantheistic perspectives based off of what you saw where it described the universe and it related to God? Can you tell me that?
Yeah, so I was a pantheist for about one day, and it was
describe what pantheism is, just so the audience knows.
So pantheism is the belief that God and the universe are essentially synonymous.
Right.
There's not a difference.
Of God.
The universe is the highest power. And after being a Christian for a long time and wanting to essentially believe in the most evident God is the universe. But by that time, I was watching a lot of atheist videos because they had all the good points, and I wanted to be able to defend myself from good points, which it turns out I couldn't. But so then they said something along the lines of, I don't remember who I was watching, but they said, if you're going to believe that God is the universe and you're just awestruck by it, why don't you just admit that the universe is the universe and you're awestruck by it? And why does there have to be more nature? Why does there have to be something more than nature? Why can't you just be impressed by the universe? And to me, that really appeals to me. That makes me, I admit to myself, maybe I don't believe in God. Maybe I want to believe in God, and I'm just superimposing any place I could possibly put it. So then I just stopped believing in that, and then I really don't know what I believe in. I know that I'm an atheist because even if I'm agnostic about whether or not anybody knows there's a God, I at least don't believe in one. And that doesn't really leave me anywhere in terms of science. So then I still have to figure out what it is I believe in. So then poetic naturalism leaves me with not what do I not believe in, but what I do believe in.
Nice. That's awesome. It reminds me of what you were saying with the poetic naturalism or the pantheistic thing. There's this old theory about the law of causality, which has been disproven. And it says that every cell comes from another cell, every tree comes from another tree, every human comes from another human. So that means the Big Bang had to come from somewhere too. And in a different dimension, or for God didn't require an origin, so he could explain the existence of our dimension. Well, singularities don't apply to the law of physics. So a singularity could have created itself out of nothing because it would be the same thing. So that's almost like similar to the concept of superimposing a agency of consciousness onto the existence of our dimension just because you want to, and you don't look at all the facts. So that's an error that I try to be cautious of as well. Because researchers' bias is a bitch. That's for sure.
Okay, so another thing that you have going on here is that you think that near-death experiences and DMT are linked, but they're also not the same. So you don't think near-death experiences send you into this other dimension you're proposing, but you do think DMT does, correct?
Oh, no, they definitely both do, I think.
Okay, so you think they both do.
I think they are literally the same.
They're just not being triggered the same way, correct?
Right, exactly. And that's the kicker, because if they were triggered the same way, well, of course, the product of the same brain reaction, but since different forms of it are causing it, more evidence to that.
Okay, so then the only thing that I can't disprove everything to you, but I definitely think that the biggest problem with your theory is how much focus it puts on purpose and how much focus it puts on intentionality. I don't know if it's not intentions per se, but purpose is the best way to say it. So like you have to assume that entheogens are purposeful, that consciousness is purposeful, that like even if it's not an agent, in order to have the effect that you want it to have, it has to know to have that effect, and also it has to have mechanisms by which it can interact with entangled particles, and then those particles have to be able to go to other dimensions, which we've never seen a particle do. And there's too many things going on that they're all just assuming that, well, something out there has a purpose to do that. I think that everything that exists in the universe could exist with no purpose whatsoever. Like even though like I have purpose in that I want to take better care of my family, I feel purposes in my life. But the only thing giving me those purposes is the fact that I feel that way. If I felt a different way, then those other ways would be my purposes. There's no objective purpose going on in the universe. So doesn't it make more sense to just kind of so for example, entheogens probably are actually just sensible molecules, and they probably exist for the reasons of what atoms make them up and how those things would arrange themselves. And that makes more sense than if they did it on purpose so that sometime in the future they could interact with something else that would capitalize on their shape so that something with a purpose could finally come about and interact with other dimensions. Doesn't that, if I'm misrepresenting you, you can tell me, but it seems a little fantastical.
So here's how I like to perceive it. So a good analogy is actually evolution itself. So let's say evolution, doesn't have any intrinsic purpose. It's kind of hard to, other than reproduction, evolution takes place and it processes and develops to the point that it can utilize and capitalize on its function, right? Its creation. Consciousness could be the same way. So consciousness could also not just have some agency and like focus in on like entheogens or biochemical arrangements in plants and molecules and eventually humans. It could have tried a myriad of failed ways to connect to something that could receive it or help to process life or evolve it, right? Any of those things. So consciousness in this sense could be considered adaptive, but not with agency. So there could have been many failed ways that consciousness attempted to become aware or has its own driving force, right? For it to be known, whatever it is, who knows what the actual driving force of the evolution of consciousness is. But I would like to think of it more of less of having its own agency and more of having its own form of metaphysical adaptivity.
So going with that metaphor, the problem with that metaphor is, doesn't natural selection already serve that purpose?
Well, yes, it would. And consciousness would be
all right, so
part of that.
So that's, to me, it's similar to saying that, I'm trying to think of something that people say that God does. So essentially people will say that like God is the reason why I'm a good person sometimes, and the only reason why I could be good. So and then I'll say, well, couldn't we explain the reason why I'm good through social evolution and through essentially the kind of creature I am and the kind of chemicals that go on in my brain specifically?
Mm-hmm.
And it would be weird to hear someone say, yes, you can explain everything you're going to do that way, but still, I think that God did it.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
But I feel that that's kind of parallel to what I feel that you're telling me now about the consciousness being in another dimension.
So, okay, here's how I look at that. I would definitely make a distinction there. And it reminds me of some dude. I never met this guy, but I heard him talking. And he was saying that he stuck his hand outside after praying for rain, and then rain appeared. And that proves that God is real to him. And that means that, God is looking out for him and making it rain for him, buddy. Look at the weather, man. Like, are there any clouds? Like, come on, that's nonsense. So I think if stuff like that didn't happen, that would be crazy, because there's always going to be coincidences that seem like synchronicities, but really aren't. I think there is a distinction to make between coincidence and synchronicity, but they're obviously not that disparate, right? They're not that evident. That's just what you get into the point of being kind of not conspiratorial, but more of a zealot extremist. So in my perspective, I think that it does make sense without this theory, but some of the processes that we experience through analyzing the subjective and objective effects of psychedelic states give credence to the idea that consciousness is non-local, along with some other things too. So there's another point I want to get into that relates to another form of evidence that consciousness is non-local. But first, I wanted to describe how I think that when you are in a psychedelic state, and you were talking about how your belief of it was that you lose the distractions, right? And then you hallucinate. Well, I think it's more of a process of spatiotemporalization, or coming into the higher self, coming into the regular form of your material self, and they integrate, kind of like the unconscious merging with the conscious mind. And that is integrating with quantum, cellular, and subatomic energies and being aware of all of them taking place at once. And that's where the higher dimensional perspectives come into play. And it doesn't necessarily have to be another dimension. And when we talk about other dimensions, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not a part of reality. All of reality includes these other dimensions. It's not like they're separate from it. They are part of reality. They're intrinsically combined into it. And string theory kind of gets into this too. But string theory, I will honestly say I know nothing about. So I know it gives evidence that other dimensions exist, and then we have a physicist argument about why this could be true. but I honestly don't understand it. So I won't try to use string theory other than the fact I know that it exists to support my argument.
Okay. So I'll start with what I think is the most prominent question. If consciousness is something outside of the body that we're receiving, I think it's a little bit curious that it's not aware of what arrangement my neurons are in. I think that if consciousness is a product of my brain, then it should have no idea what arrangement my neurons are in. It should only know what that correlates to, which is what I experience. But if it's outside of the brain, then why can't I experience what my cells are doing? Or if I grew a cancer right now in my arm in my skin, if I had skin cancer, why wouldn't I know until I saw a doctor? Or like, how come I don't know all these other things that consciousness seems to have no access to whatsoever? The only thing it seems to have access to are things that my neurons are correlated to. That's the first question.
Great. Can I answer it?
Sure. Well, the second question ties into it anyway. I'm wondering, how can we use psychedelic experiences, given that there are lots of similar ones, but there are so many different ways that people interpret them that how can we use them as evidence for anything? So you can.
Okay. I love your first question, man. I thought it was awesome. That first question is solid because literally people on DMT states or ayahuasca experience being in their cells and being in the subatomic particles that create their actual being. And they do experience that subatomic molecular interactions from a conscious perspective. So I definitely think that consciousness has those capabilities. They're just not normally accessible without expanding it. Because let's be honest, if we were all tripping all the time and a jaguar comes up to me, I'm screwed. I'm dead. You know, it's not evolutionary feasible for that to be the case. That's why DMT is immediately broken down by monoamine oxidase in the bloodstream and why it only lasts 5 minutes. Because if it was to be randomly released by the brain when you come into a near-death experience or something, it takes a very intense near-death experience to activate that. Normally, adrenaline is just released, and that's it. And DMT, if it is released at a minor degree, is broken down right away, unless it's being released so intensely that it can't be broken down. And that's no, DMT doesn't cause a near-death experience at all, so that's not true. But basically, it would not be advantageous for us to be able to access those properties on a regular basis because it would make us susceptible to environmental threats. And that's why we have functions to counteract that in the body.
Well, I don't disagree with anything you just said. I think all that is a fact. All that seems, or at least mostly, factual. But the problem is still that I've had that experience. I've had the experience that I'm experiencing the growth of my hair, or I'm experiencing something that is just otherwise non-experiencing. However, I never came out of that trip thinking that I really did experience that. I thought maybe that is what I think I'm experiencing given the weird sensations that I'm getting. So it's
then you have to test it because you can't know unless you test, and then we get into experimentation.
Right, exactly. So then you can propose any tests that you have to show that there are other dimensions or places that consciousness can go. And I just want to propose that even if there are tests, even if I can't completely rule out with 100% certainty what you're saying, that we both do need to agree that the credence goes to Occam's razor. And Occam's razor currently is that the brain produces consciousness. That may be evidence in the future will show us otherwise, but as of right now, it is really only honest to say that so far the only successful theories of anything are with the brain producing consciousness, and maybe there are other explanations for that, but we don't have that evidence yet. So as long as we can agree to that, and then you can go with what tests you think you can come up with to find other dimensions.
So actually the reason for what you just said is why my life work is not just what I'm researching, because there's a very high chance that I could be wrong about all this, and I just want to believe it because I want to believe in consciousness. So the great part is that my research on psychedelics has therapeutic value as well. So even if the razor is true and I'm wrong about all this stuff, psychedelics still have medicinal properties. They can kick addiction at an 84% success rate compared to a 15% success rate with rehab centers. I mean, why aren't we using them more often? It's crazy. Oh, Big Pharma wouldn't like that very much. So, luckily, the therapeutic, realistic, practical value of my research still exists outside of if any of these conjectures about another dimension are true. So, I will agree with you that it applies to the razor that your theory is right. Personally, I believe my theory is right based off of personal subjective experience, which cannot be considered science, which is why it's led me to want to do this research and do these tests. So there was an experience I had in Brazil where I used the legal entheogen there, at least, ayahuasca, which contains DMT. They called it Santo Daime, which means holy wine. A funny side note, you know how Jesus turned water into wine? Well, Santo Daime is a wine, so they said Jesus turned water into ayahuasca. Why would he make alcohol inhibiting your consciousness? He would make ayahuasca and you can go meet my father right away. Go talk to him, man. Like that's the thing. Great legend, great lord. But my personal experience was that I've been trying to prove that psychedelics are evidence for the divine, like for a long time, but I don't need to prove it really, at least not to myself, because basically I realized I've been trying to prove it not only to other people, but to myself too. But I don't need to prove it to myself because I can have that direct relationship and experience with what the universe is and what the collective conscious is without actually having any proof, because it's direct experience and direct relationship. And that can't be considered science. So I will agree with you on your proposition that from a completely objective, non-emotional, scientific, analytical perspective, yes, more credence should be given to consciousness being produced in the brain. But based off my own personal experience, I personally feel convictions that do not agree with that, but that's why, and I can't say that they're science because they're based off of, you could explain my subjective experience as an emotional reaction to the psychedelic trip. And that's feasible. It's realistically possible. But personally, just based off of the intensity of the experience and how direct the relationship was, it is insane to literally, you don't take any crazy knowledge from this. You just experience being a part of the entire universe. A microcosmic expression of the macrocosmic self. So in this kind of a sense, I can definitely agree with you on that. And that's why my personal convictions lead me to want to research this, because if I can prove it with empirical analysis and the scientific method, then, then it's not an argument or a debate, because right now it's philosophical, which is why it needs testing, because a theory ain't a theory unless you can test it. And that's scientific backbone right there.
All right, so what's your test?
All right, so I got a few different tests. We'll start with the ones that don't actually involve any psychedelics first. So the tests that don't involve psychedelics involve the conscious, the collective unconscious, in the terms of the realization and expression of archetypes. So archetypes are basically like psychological motifs. They're like the damsel in distress, or that's a literary one, or a cross, or a metaphysical being that tells you how to live your life and align you with ethical codes, that kind of stuff. Those are archetypes, right? Sigmund Freud's protege, Carl Jung, did a lot of research on archetypes. And he found that 10-year-olds that had never had any experience with all these different archetypes expressed them in their dreams. And so these things, these phenomena that these kids had never seen in their lives were expressed within their dreams. And they were consistent with other people's dreams that had never met those kids, thousands of dreams documented. All these archetypes are similar. So it gives evidence that these symbols are within the human consciousness in the collective unconscious. Now, maybe you could say that certain symbols are genetically entwined in the expression of our DNA, but I think that the razor is in my favor when it says that it's tied to the collective unconscious. So there are some tests that you could do to use this idea of archetypes in the experimental manner. One thing you could do is, this was someone else's idea I saw on a forum, DMT Nexus, I think. His idea was when you go to the DMT hyperspace, there's this theme of a carnival and people partying in this carnival type thing, right? You give an indigenous tribe that has never interacted with the social world intravenous DMT. Good luck getting that past an ethics board. And after doing that, you show them pictures of a clown and a carnival. And if they recognize it and they've never seen it before, based off the experience in the state, then it would show that the archetype was not manifested in the psychedelic state by their previous experiences. It was manifested as something that already existed within them. And so that's why they would experience the carnival. The whole test is to see if they still get that carnival experience without ever seeing anything like that in their lives. And so that's not necessarily proof or anything. It's solid, but it's not proof. It's just more evidence. There was a test done.
Let's start with the first test. Hold on. So on that first test, is it possible, or maybe I'm still trying to completely wrap my head around the whole thing, but isn't it possible that instead of that there are archetypes, that certain symbols mean certain things to certain people, that there is, if you want to call it an archetype, we'll say that the archetype is that people are symbolically persuadable. They can be easily seduced by their emotions and by symbolism. And so isn't it possible that if that's just part of our nature, that whatever symbols happen to permeate the culture, that those things will seem important? And even if, so like,
of course,
part of Western culture is our awareness of Eastern culture, which is why a lot of people recognize once they take psychedelics, Western culture doesn't have this down right. So then they start to go towards Eastern religion because they just assume that someone has it right.
Right.
So it's like that. To me, that's an example of symbolism where they assume already that religion is something that's right. And since they are now willing to admit that Western religion is at least more wrong, then Eastern religion just has to by default sort of be right. And so this becomes important to them. So even though it's not the most prevalent symbol in their society, it's such a prevalent symbol in their society that you can explain the decision they're making.
That's why in this experiment, you find an indigenous tribe that has never interacted with the regular world and would never have seen a carnival or a clown or anything like that in their culture. And then you give them the DMT, see if they see that in the state, and then recognize our depiction of what a carnival would be. And you could get a control group too, not give them DMT, see if they recognize it and see if there's any difference before and after. Now, this wouldn't be proof because it has alternative explanations,
right?
But it would at least be evidence towards it if this result went successful. So this is an example of an experiment that would be evidence.
All right, you can go on to the second test.
Okay, so the second test has already been conducted, and it was conducted by William Richards, who's the director of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins is very prestigious medical university, if not the most in our country. I don't know, it's like in the top 3. Anyway, so he wrote a book called Sacred Knowledge, which is about how the psychedelic state is sacred and links into a mystical experience of objectively existing consciousness as non-local, all that stuff. Well, one of the experiments he used to defend this position was he had this 17-year-old kid. He was from the ghetto, right? Very, very poor kid. Probably why he signed up to do the research study, because he got paid. Well, I don't know the morality of that, but they got through the ethics board. It was in the 60s or 70s. Probably wouldn't pass now, actually. And they give him this LSD, and he experiences a Hindu expression of Krishna, where Krishna is the god of creation and destruction, and it has its eternal dance of death and life, and it's destroying as it's creating perfect balance. Basically, he had never seen it before in his life, and Richards was like, okay, well, this is proof that this archetype exists within the collective unconscious framework. Someone else made the case, well, what if he saw it in a commercial or a journal article or a magazine or something, saw Krishna? Well, that's possible, but why would it be a predominant force in his psychedelic state, if not the main focus?
Okay, so a partial alternative. I did the same example with you last time, and I could just do it with, so think of a country.
Britain.
Right. You didn't think of the Congo.
Right.
But you could have. And you actually don't know why you didn't, because you've seen it before. I would say that as long as you've heard of something, and as long as you're taking a substance that causes your brain to reconnect with itself in new ways, it should never be completely that surprising if things that you know but seem sort of mundane or trivial regularly become very important, because they can connect to things that make you feel like things are important when your brain is reconnecting and rewiring itself. So it's possible that as long as you've heard of it at all, you can take things like I've heard of being in awe, and I've heard of gods, and I've heard of Krishna, and I'm hallucinating. And if your brain puts all of those things together, that could be things that it could have put together anyway, but just wouldn't have given other states. It just had no reason to.
True.
Now this is the only way it could. So it still could be explained through just triggering, through
Right.
priming.
And that's why it's not proof either. It's evidence, though, and it is evidence, but it's not anywhere close to proof. Now, what we could do is we could take a fetus that was about to be aborted, right? And this is all theoretical. I don't support this. Before anyone gets the wrong idea, this is just an example. We could take a fetus that's about to be aborted, and instead of aborting it, we convince the mother to let it live for scientific studies. And we incubate it for its whole life and don't let it experience any Eastern culture at all. But we treat it perfectly fine. We make sure it's never seen any Hindu gods or anything like that. And then we give it a psychedelic. And if it expresses any archetypes that we know for sure it couldn't have interacted with, then we have solid evidence that the archetype exists within the collective unconscious, and it's like a beacon. And same thing with the indigenous culture that's never experienced the real world. We could talk to them and give them psychedelics, and they express any archetype they've never seen before, and we know their tribe hasn't, and it's not in any of their culture or anything like that, then we have evidence based off of the non-interaction of the archetype actually existing. But you're never going to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's one of those, that seems the least practical so far.
Right, unless we find an indigenous tribe, but then again, to be able to inject them with psychotropics, good luck. So that's an example of a test that could be done if you had some steel balls, and you really had some pull in the academic community. But I like to talk about tests that are a little bit more realistically feasible. So there's one test I thought of, right? And I'll just give this some context. So, well, I'll talk about the theory and why it's synchronistic. So I thought of a test when I was 16 where you have someone and you give them DMT, right? So I give, let's say, Blue DMT, and I send him to the divine realm, the astral plane, hyperspace, whatever you want to call it. And I get him to tell one of the beings there, right? One of these metaphysical beings, a number. So Blue's like 12. And this being's like, okay, 12, right? Then you send Yellow there, who has not had any interaction with Blue, and ask what the number was. What was the number? It was 12. And so these two people have not interacted. They go to the dimension, tell one of the beings a number, the other one asks what it was, and if you can show that they received a communication that could have only taken place by this being in this dimensional plane, then you would have solid evidence that this dimension is actually real and accessible and objectively true. And if you tried to argue, well, maybe they used ESP or telepathy, you could separate people across the whole globe, and then have one in China and the US and then do this or something like that. Now, I don't think that test is very likely to work, but if it did, it's virtually proof. Good luck explaining that any other way. And even though it might not be considered absolute proof, the razor, Occam's razor, is still in my favor in that case.
Yeah, Occam's razor definitely leans a lot more towards you if that test was to go that way, though that's very unlikely. But I would have to say with that test, doesn't that test assume that so not only are you assuming that there's a dimension to go to, you're assuming that there's other beings in this dimension, and that they also have minds, and that they also have memory, and that they can communicate with us clearly, and that they would never lie.
Yeah, so it does make some claims that are, well, first off, we can at least analyze what people's experience with these beings are. So everyone who has a near-death experience, or 90%, let's say, or does DMT, experiences these entities, and they do communicate with us through what they call telepathy, because they don't have voices or vocal cords or anything, but they do communicate ideas and expressions and emotions. I don't know if it could actually express like a number or anything like that, but they do engage in telepathic communication with the human travelers that go to that dimensional landscape. They're known as discarnate entities in science. That's what these beings are called in that landscape. Now, they're also known as machine elves, which means they're tricksters. So it might be like, oh, the number's 12, it's 32, and like mess with the experiment or something, or like maybe they won't even be able to understand what we're saying, or maybe they do and they want to help, but then they can't travel to the other person in time. So then you might have to do time-lapsed experiments to see if that changes the effect. I also have very strong doubts that this experiment will work. But interesting.
Why? I guess what I'm asking is, if you're going to make that many assumptions, why are you making that many assumptions?
They're not very many assumptions because people do communicate with these entities and they express ideas to people that travel there. So
right. Well,
if you can do that, you might be able to capitalize on it.
That can be easily explained with pareidolia, though, because people personify things just to try to make sense of them.
Right. Both explanations work, which is why we need to test it, because otherwise we're both kind of conjecturing ideas that could be true. And until the experimentation takes place, we don't know which one is accurate.
Right. But we do know that your idea makes a whole bunch of assumptions, right? That's what I'm trying to get
Not
specifically
really.
about. Okay. So comparatively, I do not assume. I assume that all the same experiences that you are using as evidence, I actually think all those things happen too. I just have a different explanation that doesn't have any other beings, that I know that they have minds, and I know that they have memory, and I know that they can communicate with me. And I do know that people will report seeing them still. So I don't think that these things are on equal footing, because on some level, with I mean, I guess just basic integrity makes me think that you should be, I don't know, you should admit that there's a lot of assumptions here, that you really have no reason to say that because people have hallucinated things and then personified the things they hallucinate, which is something a person would do anyway, that is actually evidence that those things exist.
Well, the consistency of the interactions is evidence, because if the consistency was not applicable and it was random and they're all different all the time, then fair enough. But since different states of mind caused by different parts of the brain, DMT and near-death experiences, lead to consistent, describable, objective interactions with these entities that can be calculated and formulated and predicted, then it gives credence to the idea that they could be real, and doesn't necessarily mean it's proven, but it means that we should test it to rule it out. Well, I don't think we'd be testing it to rule it out. In my opinion, we're testing it to prove it's right. But in your idea, you would be testing it to prove it's not right, But either way, it's worthy of investigation. And in my opinion, it's worthy of substantial investigation, because all the puzzle pieces do kind of fit together in my scheme of perception. But it doesn't really matter until we test it.
Right. So, you know what Russell's teapot is?
No, I don't know.
Okay, so people say that you can't disprove that God exists, so everybody's on equal playing field. And Russell's teapot is Bertrand Russell came up with this idea that no one can disprove that there's a Chinese, or I don't remember, it's like a teapot that's just floating around the sun, and it's just perfectly on the other side of the earth and traveling at the exact same speed. You could just make as many claims as you want about it. It's invisible, so you can't actually detect it. You can't poke it with anything, but it's there. And my theory that it's there is equal to your theory that it isn't, until we have come up with a test and prove that one of us is right. And that example is created to show how absurd that is.
Right, but there's no evidence that teapot's there. My theory has anthropological, historical, sociological, quantum.
I think that some of the things that I would say is that you don't have evidence that you're right. You have indicators that your perception isn't impossible.
No, I think there is evidence that it is right. It's just not.
In order for something to be evidence of something specifically, that has to predict. Like, it has to be a novel prediction of that. So the difference between my theory and your theory is something has to be predicted different. We can't just say the universe is right no matter what, and then one of us is right, because then we're essentially saying there's no way to tell the difference.
Yeah, and we don't want to say that.
Right. So I'm not adding anything to the known universe, and you are, which is the same as the teapot example. It's not that you're wrong in terms of that it's impossible. Like the teapot example isn't impossible, and God actually isn't impossible. But the thing is, once things are indicated, it does not actually mean that you have evidence for that specifically. In order to have evidence for that specifically, it has to be evidence that I can't use.
You really can't use the evidence though. Like, okay, here's how I look at it. Even though it is adding an explanation to the universe, it is adding an explanation to serve a function of something that is not currently explained, which is the hard problem of consciousness. So your theory explains the hard problem of consciousness, but doesn't have proof that it's right. So my theory adds something to the conception of consciousness, has a way to test that, and it's worthy of testing because currently your paradigm doesn't solve for the hard problem of consciousness because it's still the hard problem of consciousness. But since it's still a hard problem and we don't have the answers, we have to think outside of the box and get creative and maybe add or subtract or do whatever, and then test those additions and subtractions to see what the actual answer to that hard problem of consciousness is. Because currently, within the current scheme of perception of science and all that, we haven't came to the answer. So we have to try some other ways of getting it because we don't have it. If our current perspective worked to get the hard problem of consciousness solved, then it would be solved, but it's not solved yet. So I think that's where the out of the box thinking comes into practicality.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not. No part of me is saying that you are on equal footing as God. God is way more ruled out than everything that you've said. So, but it's just it's it's proposing things that have no parallel anywhere else. So the invisible teapot has no parallels anywhere else. Like there's no reason to think it's there, even though it's possible. So there's a difference between having a good reason to think something is true and something being possible. To say that there are beings in another dimension that can interact with us, I mean, assuming that you mean beings like how we're beings, so they're like organisms in that other dimension.
Kind of. They're not really, they're more like spirits, I guess, and that's based off of the subjective interpretation of how they operate.
So do you believe
That's
that
why
people? So you believe that people actually have selves?
like their true self, like their spirit.
Sure, whatever you want to call it. You do you think there is? Do you think there is some center to a person?
Yes, I do.
Do you only think that because it feels that way and everyone else says it feels that way too?
No, I would say that it's a combination of many theories that all add into each other, right? So I think that it really does make sense, not only based off of my personal subjective experience with entheogenic substances, but also, like we've been saying, with the history, the quantum physics, the microtubule theory, the archetypes, and the biochemistry and the link between psychedelic states and near-death experiences not being caused by the same parts of brain activation and the consistencies of those states. So I think there's a lot to put together into that.
I don't think any of those indicate that there's a self. Okay, so
Well,
this
the
might be
self
the
is what would travel in the realm, because it's not your physical being or your
right.
brain or anything like
Right.
that. And prove that it's
So
separate.
essentially what I think I'm identifying is this is your underlying motivation for proposing this strategy. The reason why you want to I'm saying this is a prediction I'm making. I'm open to you can correct me or say whatever you want about this, but I'm just being honest. It seems like actually you have a pre-made bias towards wanting to believe there's a self. And in order to make that make sense, you're looking at all of these things through the lens of how to make the self make sense. Then you've created pictures where it's very intelligent. It makes sense in that way. And so it makes sense to you, essentially. That's what I'm trying to say. But it doesn't actually mean that you've accounted for all the stuff that you're adding on, because I can say the same thing. Like I'm almost certain, unless I heard an argument that would explain it to me about how I was completely wrong about this, I'm almost certain that I can prove that there is no such thing as a self, and that there's never been a such thing as this, as like a center self, and it wouldn't make sense if there was. It's better that there even isn't.
Okay, so I think really let's substitute self, right? For my main drive for all of this is proving that consciousness is non-local and then taking what you want from that. So I think that that's personally more of a driving factor than a self, but I think that the self in my paradigm has to exist mainly because if this dimension is objectively real and we're interacting with discarnate beings that exist within it consistently, well, that self is the thing that has to be doing the interacting because it's outside of our brain, it's outside of our dimensional channel. So that's why the self almost has to exist in my postulations, because otherwise, what would be doing the interacting in that realm that could experience the energetic frequencies of these beings and then come back into the spatio-temporalized three-dimensional world and then still be able to somewhat be processed? Even though when you get back from a DMT experience, you remember like 2% of it, which is because a lot of it's incompatible with our brain and our reality. Even though we can experience it as ourself, we can't process it fully in our brain because it's literally in a different dimension. How do you process that when you've never experienced it in your three-dimensional construct of what reality actually is? So I think that that's mainly the self isn't the core of my theory. It just has to be in my theory for my theory to work. But I think
Yeah.
the main driving force is non-locality of consciousness.
Okay. Um, what do you think is different from yourself and your consciousness?
I think that's a hard question. And honestly, I don't think I know the answer. I think there's a lot of open possibilities to what that might mean. But I think that your consciousness, the way I would describe it, your consciousness is your whole mindset, right? It's linked to your brain still as a receiver, which makes sense why if your brain gets damaged somewhat, your consciousness behaves differently. And your memories and stuff are embedded in there too, so that all matters, right? And it's the interaction between your consciousness, your biology, and yourself that makes you who you describe yourself as your ego. So I think there's different things because you have who you describe yourself as and you self-identify. Me as Isaac, right? But me as Isaac is not necessarily my true self, or I wouldn't say true self. That's actually more my true self, because it's me, because it's my biology and my memories and my consciousness all linking together. But my higher self, or however you want to call it, like my spirit or whatever, is linked to the consciousness that exists that is being received by my brain, but not a combination of the interactions between my brain and that form of what is being received through as consciousness. So I think there's a distinction to make between what we identify as our ego, which is like kind of our true self, what we express ourselves as, and then what we would express ourselves as in terms of what is doing the interacting with these discarnate beings in the dimensional plane that would be like, I wouldn't say our true or higher self, but more of like our root self.
Okay. So the strongest trip and probably the strongest experience I have ever had in my life was on a strip of acid at Electric Forest, and I was just staring at the stars. And so you kind of have a model where you have your brain, and your brain is linked to consciousness, and either your brain creates this ego or you just have a self as well that rides around, and so there's like a triangle where you have your brain and then you have consciousness and then you have yourself, and they're all linked. During my trip, I experienced the world in a way that I know I don't have a self.
Interesting.
So it's hard for me to understand how, from your research, all the evidence points you in that direction. Because I think that once I came down from that, I could never really reiterate all of what I was realizing, because it was only like things that you realize when you're paying attention. It's not things that you realize when you think really a lot.
Right.
So it's hard to reiterate, but I knew what I had realized, and now I'm realizing it more and more and more in ways that it was always right there in front of me. But it's just too appealing to think of it in other ways, because then I'm cool.
So
That's
I think
literally. Go ahead.
interesting that you're using your psychedelic state as evidence for your claim honestly, because that's where the evidence from my personal claim that the objectivity of consciousness exists outside of the human self. And that was based off my trip, and I learned it and knew it based off of a psychedelic state. So if I
Right.
can't trust what my experience was based off of a psychedelic state in terms of consciousness being non-local, how can you trust your psychedelic state telling you that there's no self?
So actually, I don't. I don't trust anything, I think, ever. But what I do trust is how things work out. So if something ends up being a reliable thing for me to think, because if I think it and then act like it's true, it works out for me whether I'm sober or tripping or anything, then
Mhm.
that seems to be something that's has to be more true because it helps me navigate my observations. So if it doesn't help me, then it's equal. I don't know. It might be true, but I won't even know how. But
Right.
so the idea that I don't have a self has helped me navigate things way beyond that trip that I would have never been able to do it as well as I did if I didn't know that. And
That's
it's not
awesome.
that right. So to me, it's not just that I was wholesomely convinced because I wasn't wholesome. I mean, I felt wholesomely convinced, but then as soon as I came down, my skeptical brain was like, you're on drugs. So
Good still, you should always have that no matter what.
right. So I don't believe anything that I just think. I don't believe anything. No matter how convinced I am by my initial reaction to something, that doesn't really mean there's more evidence because I felt stronger when I first thought it. So I just
Fair enough.
so instead I give myself time to try to make the idea play out and beat other ideas and be honest with myself about what's the best. And then as I just continue
Ah,
so if I just continue to go in that direction, I have confidence and that's where my confidence in I don't have a self comes from.
got it. So that was what originated the conception, and then it was verified after.
Well, I think I already knew that some people thought that, but it was the first time I ever experienced the world in a way that is like it both explained what I thought I was experiencing before and how that was true at the same time.
That's fascinating. It makes me think, okay, so in terms of like the self and like the higher self, a lot of people think that God is at the top dimension, right? Or collective consciousness or whatever, Tao energy or all that source. It's at the top, right? And we're below it. And, we try to reach those elevated states. Well, in my opinion, we'll just use God for the sake of clarity. God is at the base dimension, right? And that we're above that because God permeates through everything, just like consciousness would. So, or consciousness is probably better. So that's at the base, and it all goes up like that. And then we experience the deceleration of the conception of consciousness when we use psychedelics, going down into the fiber of what reality actually is. And I actually like the way that you put it earlier, like removing all of your distractions in the world. Like, I think that if you remove the distractions of the material plane, which aren't necessarily distractions in the sense that they're fake, but distractions in the sense of being able to perceive other dimensional planes that the brain can naturally tune into, then you see the interactions of the universal energies that are occurring that you can perceive. You just were limited from because of your attachment to reality that you need to survive. Otherwise, you're going to get killed by a coyote in the woods. So I think that is a good way of explaining how that actually would function, and kind of relates to something you said earlier, but I'm using it in a totally different way.
Yeah, I can see that. But so essentially, uh, the difference between whether the Earth is flat or the Earth is round is the difference between whether or not we can set up a world where we can fly anywhere, or whether we have to fly to specific places at once because you can't get from here to here.
Right.
So, practically speaking, I think the world would be better set up and function better if we just admit things that are true. And one of those things is that we don't have selves. I don't I don't think that that's as much of an opinion. I don't know. I guess it is my opinion, but I don't see, based on all the evidence we have right now, how is anything free? So in one moment something's going to happen. And at the end of that moment, or at the end of this moment, that's what decides what that happens in that moment. So there's literally no freedom whatsoever for the next moment in time to be anything other than the consequences of right now. So we're already in the consequences of just then. It's
But
too late.
that
It's
away.
too late. We're already surfing.
Because if you have free will and you have awareness, then you can actually choose what happens. But to be fair, I don't think free will is all that exists. You know how everyone says everything happens for a reason? You know, people will say that all the time. Well, the same people say that free will exists. Well, listen, dude, if everything happens for a reason, then you ain't got no free will. You know what I mean? Like, because everything would be predetermined. And if predetermination is the nature of the universe, then free will does not exist.
Do you have any evidence for free will whatsoever?
Evidence for free will?
Yeah.
I think the evidence for free will comes from the awareness of making decisions at a conscious level that can be experienced through psychedelic states, but also without them. And so I think basically...
Hold on, let me make sure that you're defining this the way I understand. So you think free will is the awareness of the decision that gets made?
And choosing it consciously, because a lot of people don't have free will, right?
So
they have it, but they don't access it because they're just reacting to things without thinking about it. When
and
you
how
have
could
awareness
you
of it,
tell the difference? How could you tell the difference between whether you were choosing something consciously or whether you were noticing yourself be influenced by a craving by a different part of your subconscious brain?
You would not be able to. You would need to test the idea of the origin of consciousness first without that, because even if you think that awareness exists, right?
But really, doesn't that undermine your evidence, though?
Well, no, it doesn't undermine evidence, right? Because, okay, so here's the thing. If you have evidence, or what I'm trying to say is, if you are the result of automatic processing, right? And you just automatically react to stimuli as they come, just letting them fly through, you really aren't enacting your free will. But if you're someone that has stimulus brought to them, and then they think about it and are aware of it and decide what to do off of that, then that is what free will actually is. And you wouldn't be able to tell if the conscious awareness is also the reaction of automatic processing in a different way. So you would actually have to test is the nature of consciousness itself, instead of being able to test whether or not, because there's no conceptual way of knowing, you know, if anything that you think is the product of a reaction of something else you thought, even if you think you're being aware of it.
Well, even if you don't know it, it is the only thing that's been indicated ever. So we don't have to know it with 100% certainty to know that it's the only thing that is reasonable to believe.
I wouldn't agree with that, just because I think free will is such an amazing concept, because people actually do. I wouldn't say that their objective or subjective experience of free will proves that it actually exists, but it gives credence to the idea that it could, at least. And I think that the notion that it could is more well documented and verified if the nature of consciousness is non-local and quantum.
So,
and it would make sense how that could actually take place.
All right, then let me ask you, what are some examples of some decisions that consciousness can make?
Anything. Okay, so I think basically any conscious decision could be made about literally anything. So anything that is an automatic process could be a conscious concept or a conscious reaction if you're aware of it. So it all comes down to a level of conceptual awareness. And without
but that means consciousness isn't doing anything. It's just aware of automatic processes that are, right?
Well, and then it actually collapses the quantum wave function and decides what does happen, which is how the microtubule fibers are explained to operate in the objective.
So I don't think that the things that your neurons are considering are quantum mechanical.
So then that would be, you would basically be saying that the or theory of consciousness is not correct.
No, because I don't know if I understand that completely. But I am saying that the things that you're sure, the things that your brain is considering is not happening in any one neuron. It's based on patterns that are firing.
Oh yeah, many connections between.
So at that point, it's too late to be quantum mechanics. You are way too big and interconnected of a system. So even if quantum mechanics does play a role in the brain, it cannot possibly play a role here. Because by the time consciousness is receiving the information, it's receiving information that entire patterns of neurons are the representative correlate of that's what that information is. So quantum mechanics is long out of the picture by the time your consciousness is receiving anything. So there can't be free will on that level. It can't exist.
I don't know if I would jump to that claim, though. I don't know how that actually would take place within the brain, but the microtubule fibers are connected in a grid, right? So here's how I think that this could be well explained. Do you know what the mycelium floor grid is? I'll just explain it for the audience because barely anyone knows what the hell I'm talking about right now. So the mycelium floor grid is a combination of mushrooms in the ground, right? Mycelium represents mushrooms. It's a property of fungus. And basically they are interconnected in the ground, kind of like a central nervous system is in a human. And so this mycelium floor grid operates to the point to where a tree suffering from water deprivation could access water or something like that from another tree that could channel nutrients through this mycelium floor grid to promote the health of the other tree, right? And so they're all interconnected in a central nervous map in the ground. Microtubule fibers in the brain are similar. So the whole neural network of the brain can process information interconnected to a degree that's so rapid and fast that it can be connected all at once, even though it's a large system that's the reaction of all of that entangled combinations. And even microtubules can even interact with each other quantumly without interacting just like particles do in quantum physics. So one particle that is interacting with another particle can send information without being physically in the same space. Benzene rings within microtubules work in the same way, and they can also be involved. So not only can the benzene rings of the microtubules process information coordinately, but also the grid of the microtubules that are connected within the brain is similar to the mycelium floor grid. And that's how this free will conception could be concocted from consciousness being received.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying. I don't know if I can say it. I don't completely understand what you're saying. I'm trying to model what you're saying. So how do you think you're getting free will out of this?
That's how consciousness would be able to operate at a level that is still. So you were saying that it can't be consciousness, right? Because many neurons connecting with each other, it's too big. Well, it's not too big, really. They could connect, and consciousness could be received, and consciousness could be the observant awareness that makes a decision not as a reactionary automatic process, but something that's more than that.
So you think that that's where quantum mechanics comes in, correct?
That's where the quantum mechanics would come into play partly, but it's also more than quantum mechanics because the way that the neural network with the brain is connected that's like the mycelium floor grid with plants.
So what information?
Not quantum.
What information do you understand quantum mechanics can send through entanglement?
Very little. But that's related. Not related to benzene rings.
Do you know what kind of information quantum mechanics can send that way?
Isn't it position and direction? Or isn't it one or the other?
No, that's like the double slit experiment. That has more to do with whether or not you're measuring the system or not. Quantum whether or not the kind of information that quantum particles send back and forth is things like their spin and things like that. So in order for this theory to make sense, quantum spin and that sort of information needs to be the most important information in the universe because it determines everything everyone decides by free will.
Particles operate, right? If consciousness is a product of if consciousness is related to a quantum level, then it might interact information that's different than what particles are observed to interact with at a quantum level.
It's not changing which particles are observed. The particles are already going to be behaving that way once they're already entangled. By the time something's entangled, it's already interacted with the system, so it's going to be a particle. But at that point, the behavior of it is still quantum mechanical until that gets determined by either side. And but the information that is being determined it literally can go only one of two ways. So everything has to come down to a coin flip kind of information. And it's literally just determined on the spot, and then the other one has to go by what it's going by. So sometimes some people's brains don't even not have free will. Like the mechanism by which some people have free will, actually some people are just determining something because a galaxy somewhere on the other side of the universe did something, and they just happen to be forced into that now based on that coin flip.
Oh, I see. So you're saying that it would actually take away free will.
It would take away free will, and also, like, it doesn't make sense to try to say that quantum mechanics can send the kind of information your consciousness uses around, because it doesn't send information around. It just is a correspondence between two particles that is instantaneously determined, and
Well,
that
it does
the
make
thing
sense.
the thing that's correspondent isn't things like color or anything like that. It's
Right.
like a property of just that particle itself, and
But if
that property.
quantum
Go
at
ahead.
that level, it could be different. It doesn't mean that it behaves exactly how entangled particles would interact with each other. And they could interact with each other a different way. You brought up the double slit experiment, right? And I want to point something out. So you know how we brought up Emoto's water experiment? I told you about the water molecules looking different. It was a bunch of bullshit. You'll hear about it later, and now you know it's BS. Anyway, there was also an experiment done that looked at the same thing, and it used double slit. So you know how double slit, you look at it, you change what happens, right? Well, they wanted to see if it was consciousness that changed it and not just the human system, right? The outside human system being observing it instead. So what they did is they had people meditating next to the double slit, and they conceptualized the result in their mind's eye, but they didn't actually see it. Turns out that conceptualizing it within your own mind and not actually observing the system, but thinking you did consciously, still changes the result much more than a control. And only experienced meditators were able
That's been debunked, though.
That could meditate.
That study has been debunked by just better physics. So
Has
the thing is, yeah. So the actual the current consensus amongst particle physics is that the thing that makes this happen is measurement, and it doesn't really matter when you measure it. It matters that you measure it. Have you heard of the quantum eraser experiment?
I haven't.
Okay. I don't think that I can do this justice. I only know of the experiment, and I know of the outcome, and I understand it. But I don't think that I can do the entire series of why that was conceived and everything. So I would just recommend that everyone look up the quantum eraser experiment, because essentially it proves that the particle can essentially be a particle in retrograde. I don't know how to say that better, but it's not consciousness that's making a difference. It's the fact that the particle is interacting ever. So if you don't interact with the system and you meditate on one way or the other, it's going to act like you didn't interact with it until you interact with it, and then it's going to act like you interacted with it. So there's no way around that, no matter what you meditated on.
Oh, I see. I gotcha. Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Well, does this debunk the part of the study where they used people on the internet that weren't even in the same area, and that still changed the result of the closed system of the double slit observation?
If you bother to measure the system, then you are quantum mechanics interacting with the system. Because we're made of quantum mechanics. That's where everything comes from.
Oh, right.
So the problem is that when quantum mechanics interacts with itself, it behaves like a particle from that position. It appears to be in that position functionally.
Mm-hmm.
But in actuality, it's not in that position. So if you're not interacting with it, it just isn't functioning as a particle at all. So it's not one or the other. It's only ever a particle when you're interacting with it.
Okay, so I'll give you that one actually. I didn't know that was debunked. Luckily, I don't think that consciousness affecting physical reality is needed for my theory to work. You know what I mean? It just needs to be received by our consciousness, it just needs to be received by our brain. That's my main point. It doesn't necessarily, when we talk about how consciousness affects physical reality, then you get into supporting like the law of attraction, like The Secret, which is a bunch of BS, dude. Like, oh my gosh, people bring out The Secret. I just want to gouge my eyes out. Like, okay, I know where this conversation's going.
My favorite, I saw someone posted the law of attraction, a meme like that on one of these Facebook groups that I'm a part of, that I'm only really a part of because they're hilarious. And someone posted, if the law of attraction was true, then 15-year-old boys would be getting the most pussy. And to be fair, that's true. If you get what it is you focus on the most, 15-year-old boys would be getting all the pussy.
That's a good point, actually.
So that's probably not true.
There.
Yeah, bubble popped.
Wait, I thought the experiment was interesting because, like, with the Dr. Emoto's water test, I wanted to believe it was true, but we have to trust science more than we trust our desires for something to be authenticated. So, and I think that's an important concept. So back into the testing ways, right? Okay, so you know how I brought up that test where you send someone to the realm, they ask a number, someone else asked what the number was.
Yes.
So I was telling my professor, he had just told me about a book. It was called the Illuminatus Trilogy, and it was about how you could take psychedelics to expand your consciousness and see objective truth, right? He had just told me about that book. I never heard of it. Well, then I told him about this theory because I thought he'd think it was interesting, and he did. And I told him that the number was 23, and he like looked at me and was like, "Why did you say 23?" And I was like, "Well, when I was 16, I wrote a horror story where this guy goes into the DMT realm and sees his own death. And he's like freaked out. So he asks the researchers if it's a real place. And they're like, no, don't worry. We sent someone to the hyperspace and said the number 23. And they came back with the letter W. So it's not real, don't worry. And he's like sitting in bed like, whew. Then he's like, wait a second, W is the 23rd letter of the alphabet. It is real. And then he ends up dying. And it's like super scary. It was a creepypasta, actually. So that's why I chose it. It was just based off a story. Well, interestingly, he told me that the book he just recommended, the Illuminatus Trilogy, 23 in that book is the portal to the divine. And my test was using 23 to show that there is a portal to the divine. So I thought it was a crazy synchronicity. These kinds of things lead me to think, like, just like with my experience in Brazil, that I am on a path that shows that this is true for a reason, even though it's not the conventionally standard perspective, because it can explain processes that are not currently explained by the current scientific paradigm. And if it was random, then that's fucking hilarious. It was crazy interesting. But that's just a variation. That's the same number test, just a funny kind of side note on it. But there is one other test that I think that we could use to test whether or not the DMT hyperspace is for real. So do you want to say anything about any of that first before we go into that?
I'm just noticing how many words you're using, like divine, synchronicity, dimension, non-locality, portal, quantum information. A lot of the words that you're using, I think that the reason why you leave yourself room to believe the things you believe is because you pick things that you don't understand and that are really hard for everyone to understand. That allows things to be ambiguous, so that way you can fill spaces that if you understood things better, like the rain process is just heated up water, cool down water, heated up water, cool down water. When you understand that, it kind of becomes hard to implement other things you want it to be. And I don't necessarily think that means you're wrong, or I'm not saying that or whatever, but I am saying that it's an interesting thing for you to maybe look into, is that I'm noticing there's a lot of super ambiguous, vague wording that I don't think you're using it completely incorrectly all the time, but I think that you're using things that are specifically very mysterious, and you're saying this mystery equals this mystery equals this mystery, and that doesn't actually make it less mysterious.
Well, I think that the whole point of using these terms is that we're trying to explain a phenomenon that is not currently explained by conventional standards. So, to explain something that's not conventionally understood by the scientific method, then you have to get into the nature of abstractions. But I don't think I'm really using these terms ambiguously, considering that I'm describing the dimension that I'm proposing in depth, and quantum entanglement has been pretty solidly described by us with microtubules and benzene rings. And a portal is just, I mean, if you ambiguously understand a portal, I don't think you understand the conception that is just a linking between two areas.
I'm not trying to take away abstraction from you. I'm saying that I think the reason why the puzzle pieces fit together so well is because you're the one who gets to cut them out. And that's the whole problem.
So I can understand that perspective, right? But that's why testing matters. Because if I can prove my theory is true through experimentation, then it's no longer philosophical rambling, you know? Even though the puzzle pieces fit together rather nicely in this conceptual definition, it doesn't matter, because I could have the best, I could pick, you know, my theory is decent, you know, it's not bad, it puts puzzle pieces together. I could have it 10 times better, you know? I have theories that range from physics and stuff I know nothing about, and it still doesn't mean it's true, you know? Like, Roger is the same way. Like, it doesn't mean that what I'm saying or putting down is accurate, even if it fits together perfectly, which would make the scientist. I'll give you an example. I was reading my chemistry book the other day. They were saying it would not be a scientific observation to say that this is how this chemical structure is written. It means that the way this chemical structure is written in abstraction correlates perfectly with experimentation, but it doesn't mean that it's true. So that's where you get into needing the actual application of empirical verification to determine if this is just a well pictured together piece of bullshit, or if it's actually something that describes the true nature of reality. And that's why I put so much focus into the actual testing of these theories. And I don't put as much, like we were saying earlier, you shouldn't put as much credence as this as mainstream science. Well, that's why my main focus is researching the therapeutic value of psychedelics, because that's not abstract or metaphysical or anything. It's just solidly true. We know it helps people. That is the focus that we should work on. And with researching microtubules, turns out they affect Alzheimer's. So really, you should be focusing on researching Alzheimer's and microtubules, and on the side, putting 20% of your energy into researching how this could be evidence for an abstract concept that you've put together yourself. So I do think my theory is right because of personal experience and subjectivity, but you can't just trust that objectively. You need the experiments to work, which is why I'm so excited to actually become a scientific researcher, which, you know, for anyone that doesn't know, I'm studying to be a medical scientist. So once I actually know about the actual processes in full, because I would agree with you, like, I understand to a degree what I'm trying to express, but I don't understand it like someone like Roger Penrose or someone like Rick Strassman from New Mexico does. You know what I mean? Once I'm at that level, then my experiments will replicate that. Or maybe I won't even want to do any experiments because I'll think it's a bunch of bullshit. Or maybe I'll be so passionate about doing my experiments because I'm so convicted that I think they're the best experiments ever. I can't wait to see what actually turns out from that. So there's one other experiment I have that I think is interesting. We talked about it last time, but that's basically the last test I have personally.
Go ahead. What's the other test?
Okay, so here's the other test. So there was a test about psychonauts in the US. It was done by Simon and Bard. And basically they did this test to see if psychonauts have a similar perspective on morality compared to the regular population. Turns out they were right. Psychonauts had a very similar objective moral belief compared to regular people. They thought the same thing about ethics. Well, they wondered, is this just in the United States? So Lerner did a cross-cultural study linking 3 different areas of the world geographically. And I think it was India, the US, and I can't remember where the other place was. And basically, they found the same thing. They found that psychonauts all around the world have a similar belief on morality compared to the regular population. So that in itself is evidence that you are going to an objective realm that contains information about the nature of the universe, Or maybe you're even going into your own self to access this truth, but it is integrated into the structure of reality. But the problem is, we don't know if that's based off of the existential part of it, the metaphysical part, which I think it is, or a variety of other confounds. So to prove that it actually is because they're linked up to an objective truth, you would have to rule out the other possibilities. So the last test I have is ruling out the other possibilities of why psychonauts have a similar belief about morality compared to the regular population. And so I have 2 ideas of ruling out 2 possibilities so far.
Go ahead.
So the first idea of ruling out is it because they're linking to an objective root dimension, or is it because they have a similar predisposition to take psychedelics? And that's a great argument. So if people that are going to take psychedelics in their life have a similar perspective on morality, then of course psychonauts believe the same thing. That's why they took psychedelics in the first place. That's why they believe this stuff, you know? They believe that before they ever tripped anyways. So you'd have to take people's perspectives before they ever had a psychedelic experience. They get 500 people before they ever trip, and 500 people after, like a big group of people. And for the people that did trip after, you see if their moral perspectives changed after they take the psychedelic based off of their perspectives before. And then you can rule out the possibility that it's because of a predisposition to take psychedelics that they had the moral change. That's the first one.
Okay. The only thing that I'm thinking is that you're not ruling everything out, but so you can go ahead and rule out. You can go ahead and explain the other test, and then I'll tell you what you're not ruling out.
Awesome. So we checked that one off, predisposition,
Yep.
mainly. You could still make an argument that it is a predisposition, actually, with that. And there's another test that you could roll out. You just have to string the test together. But anyway, it mainly proves that's where the razor comes into play. Easiest explanation is that it rolled out the predisposition.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so the next one is that what if the actual biochemical effect of the psychedelic is causing the change, right? What if it's because, say you roll out the predisposition, but then what if it's just because the drug does that, you know? It's because this drug changes your beliefs about morality because of the, you know, subatomic interactions with neurons or whatever, right? You could roll that out based off of a test based off a derivative of another experiment that was already done. So there was an experiment done where Tibetan monks, which those guys are crazy, they were given intravenous LSD, right? And they were asked about its intensity. And they said, yeah, that was crazy, but it was nothing compared to my meditative experiences. And the researchers were like, what the heck? And, you know, same with Rick Strassman, when he saw that people thought their experience was more real than real, it's like, what the heck? It's freaky. So basically, you would use that same concept and you would give those monks intravenous DMT. And if their internal meditative experiences are deeper than the intravenous DMT that's been given through an administrative method, then you would show that the way that that reaction is initiated and your relationship with the space is more important. It changes. It's not just the biochemistry. It's not just the drug hitting those receptors. But for this also, you'd have to prove that DMT is the cause of transcendental states linked to their meditation. So this one's a little hard too, because then you also have to do additional research. But if you can show that those two are linked and that the same concentration of internal and external release substances causes a different result, then you would show empirically that it's not because of the biochemical nature of the drug affecting you in some way, but because of something else. And I would say it would be because of the metaphysical interactions with objective truth. But you could still make other claims as to what else could be causing that moral change.
Yeah, so I think when we're trying to explain in terms of, I don't know that we can necessarily say that it's a moral change, because back to my theory is that human nature is already like this and that we distract ourselves from it. So if psychedelics work the way I think it does, because consciousness works similar to how I think it does, then it doesn't have to be a predisposition to taking psychedelics. It doesn't have to be that you're tripping per se, like the chemicals themselves are changing you to become more moral. That's not
Right.
necessarily what's happening. And it also doesn't have to be that there's an objective dimension that everything is actually really experiencing. It could just be that there's an objective nature that humans have. And short of having things wrong with your brain that makes you a sociopath or a psychopath, people are social and they're good to each other and they know that they need each other. They get egos and they get carried away with distractions, but that is over top of things. So if when you take psychedelics, you see through all of the bullshit that you're feeding yourself and you really let yourself buy into what you really are like anyway, then that would allow for everybody to kind of come to the same conclusion through different paths that seem very similar because everyone's learning from the same kind of errors.
Hmm.
So in that world, really, all of your tests might rule out things, but they're not ruling out that it's just part of the species we are.
Wow, actually, to be honest with you, I actually never thought before you brought this up to me that that was a possibility of the state. And I was worried about that. I was worried. So I figured out a way to rule out predispositions and biochemical effects. What other explanations are there that then would need to be ruled out? Well, actually, you just proposed one of the options that it's not that I considered that could explain it. So to be totally honest with you, I don't know how you would actually prove that that's not what's causing it. But I'd love to think of ways that it could be, think of possibilities and ways of ruling that out. I'm going to definitely have to think about that. And if you think of any, let me know. That sounds awesome.
Right.
But yeah, that's great. That's a great proposal. And there are probably going to be more things like that where people are like, well, what if it's this? And what if it's actually this? And then, well, take the sword of Akasha to it, because the Akashic records, they're like, they hold all the information of human consciousness. We'll take the Akashic sword to it. We'll slam it right there. So I think that's a good proposition. It's a good theory about why this could actually be taking place based off of psychedelics. And that might actually be true. So that's it. Very interesting.
Awesome. I'm just throwing the things out there that are alternatives to the explanations you're coming up with.
I was actually going to ask you earlier, you were saying how free will, the self couldn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Within your theory of reality, like the self couldn't. I wanted to ask you, if the self was proven to exist, but my theory was not proven to be right? Like, let's say only thing we know is the self exists. Mm-hmm. How would you integrate that into your perception of reality?
I would have to change my perception of reality because my current perception of reality is that everything is either atomic or it's chemical. And that explains why certain things burn and why certain things dissolve and why certain things explode and why certain things implode. And everything is based on just the reality of the details of the scenario preceding it. Even though that's kind of oversimplified, that's essentially what I believe.
I got you.
And so in order to believe that something can steer those chemicals, like essentially, I think that my urges are chemical. That's what that is. So everything I see is a chemical. Everything I thinking is just chemicals, and everything is chemicals. In that way, the self would have to explain something, and whatever it explained would have to change everything else I already understand about the world, because I can explain my feelings, I can explain my thoughts, I can explain my self-conceptions, I can explain other people's experiences, I can explain all my observations this way. But there are certain observations that I have no idea how I could possibly have experienced short of there not being free will.
Interesting. So it would just basically be a paradigm shift if that was proven. It'd be like, oh, fuck. Same thing for me. If it's proven that the self does not exist, then I would have to change my conception of reality as well. So I think that's a solid answer. So I think that we've pretty much covered like the core of our disagreements pretty well. And I wanted to ask, what would you define your philosophical position as? Would it be poetic naturalism?
I don't know. I think that I like the idea that my philosophical position on like existence specifically.
Yeah.
My philosophical position on existence. Poetic naturalism isn't bad. The only thing I don't agree with about poetic naturalism is how much credence certain things are given. So, like, I think that from the scale of quantum mechanics being real to tables being real to free will being real, I think that if we're going to admit that that's like a black to white scale and we're headed towards white being not real, black is real, then as we get towards free will, we're dangerously close to white if we're not actually at white. I think at certain points of Sean Carroll's version of poetic naturalism, what he's saying is actually that because misconceptions are real and because they are practical for some durations of time, that makes them actually real. And I don't think that I agree with that. But other than that, I agree with all that you take the credences of science most seriously and then you build from there. And any new evidence that comes in is what you have to agree with.
Sounds like Jordan Peterson on God. It might not be real, but we all think it's real. So it's real in that way. That basically is the same kind of thing.
Yeah, I disagree with both of those things equally.
Fair enough. I think very interesting debate. Oh yeah, we were talking about it earlier between him and Sam Harris. Remember, he was like, Sam Harris was like, listen, Jordan Peterson was asked if Jesus really died and resurrected. He was like, it took me 10 hours to answer that question. Well, why don't you just say more than likely not? Why do you gotta make all these extrapolations? Which is what I want to make sure I'm cautious of, because researcher's bias is a bitch, and you got to be cautious that you're pushing those grounds too far. But at least if I'm doing it, I'm not aware of it. I think he is aware of it, and that's where I think the distinction could be made. But you should always try to become conscious of it, and then you can invoke your free will on that thing, and then you can do what you want to do after that. But we would disagree on that fundamentally. But Oh well, it's funny still. I would say that on my perspective, if you asked me when I was 16, I'd say I would be a dick about it, and I'd be like, I'm a misanthropic, nihilistic, agnostic theist, and people are just like, screw off, dude. Now I pretty much I would just say I'm a metaphysician and the most abstract concept. But hilariously, I asked my mom's boyfriend the other day, "What are you?" And he was like, "Oh, I'm an absurdist." And I was like, "What? What does that mean?" And basically what absurdism is if there is a being or a God or a consciousness, it's so far beyond anything we could possibly hope to understand, it's absurd. It's totally beyond anything we could come close to comprehending. And I was like, oh, no, I like that. Not bad. So I might answer with that from now on, just to see people's reactions. Like, do you think I asked a different question? Like, what the hell does that mean? But I was talking with someone about this earlier, one of my good friends that goes to OSU, and he was saying how we're talking about how consciousness is not considered to be testable by science, or at least not like other dimensions and stuff like that, like those states of being, they can't be like put under scrutiny. But I was making the point that they could, based off of entheogens, like the tests that we already thought of. So I think that, a lot of people think that this stuff is outside of the domain of science because, theology, for example, everyone thinks, and it's in the precursor to most science classes, science doesn't test metaphysics because it can't. Well, if you can get creative and think of ways that it can, then you could either rule or rule out the existence of metaphysical phenomenon and how they interact with the world regularly. And then you can make them no longer distinct and just apply science to them as something that operates in the universe. So that's what I'm kind of hoping this all leads to. And regardless of whether or not it's proven right or wrong, at least we'll have some evidence to go off of instead of leaving this to the domain of theologians and religious extremists.
I agree. Always get more evidence.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the main point that we do agree on is, it's great to talk about this kind of stuff, and it's very philosophical, but until you have data, you have nothing, Well, that's not to say that that's true in terms of what you have for yourself, right? Because I'm not going to tell a Christian or a spiritual person they have nothing, because they can't prove it. because they do have something. They have a tangible relationship that they can interact with. But in terms of what that means to somebody else, then it's nothing. You know what I
Right.
mean? Because
I
it's
do.
just for them. So what I want is this to be more than just for myself. I want to be able to have it mean something to other people. And for that, you need to do some tests and some experiments. And so maybe because of some of the things we've talked about, we'll think it's of even more tests and stuff. You know, I'm excited to hypothesize conjectures of ways of proving it's not a distraction and stuff like that. You know, it's fun stuff. This is why I love debates like this, because then you actually, it's not an echo chamber. You know, you're not talking to someone who disagrees with everything you say. You need oppositional viewpoints to let your own grow. So that's why I always encourage these kinds of debates. And I'm really glad we could have this one, because you're a great person to debate with. You're respectful, open-minded, and interesting. And that's pretty rare to find someone that you can talk to like that doesn't get like heated and emotionally reactive, you know, and doesn't take into consideration anything you say. So thank you for that.
Definitely. I think everything the current world needs to learn how to disagree and not just run away. Disagree and like agree to disagree should no longer mean agree to just leave it there. It should mean agree to flesh it out, figure it
I
out.
agree with that too. And I think that should be the biggest take home point of our whole conversation. Because if people can do that in other facets of life too, not just theological debates or metaphysics, but even personal relationships and psychological concepts and all that stuff, then we'll continue to learn even more as a species collectively and on an individual level. And no matter how you look at it, that's an awesome thing.
I agree. Yeah, you have anything else you wanted to add?
All I want to say is we be good examples of that. But yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up everything we wanted to talk about. We covered everything I wanted to say. The last thing I'll say is we'll wrap it back up at the beginning, just so everyone knows. We're posting this on the As Above, So Below thread, and it is being concluded from where it started. So all the way back around, the snake that eats its own tail, the Ouroboros, is seen. So I'm
Thanks,
glad
Isaac.
we circle. Yeah, thank you. I think we should have another conversation sometime too, and we can expand on concepts we learn in like a month or so. I think that'd be sweet.
Definitely. We'll see how much we learn and what we can get into.
Right. It's probably going to be interesting amount, and we'll see what happens. But thank you, Ryan, for the conversation. Everyone on YouTube, thank you for watching. Comment your ideas, things that you think about, and are there any comments right now?
I'm not sure. Let me see.
Wonder if anyone has any questions. If anyone has any questions that we don't answer in this video, or if there's no questions, any questions that come after, we'll try to hit on in the next video. So go ahead and propose anything you'd like us to discuss or talk about, and we'll get to you, I promise.
The only thing I have is, could you please explain your picture of consciousness without a self?
Oh,
So obviously that's for me.
you?
I'm sorry, what's that?
Didn't I ask you that exact question? What would you do if self was proven to exist? Or I guess it's like the opposite question.
Yeah, it's the opposite question. How is it possible that there is no self if there's consciousness? Okay,
Well,
so
that's great.
from my understanding, consciousness is not a special kind of reaction that is free from all the other ones. So the problem with thinking that consciousness is yourself is that it's always changing. It's based on fundamental things that are changing, and those things are fundamentally changing. And there's no consistent thing for you to like ground yourself to. Everything is being replaced constantly and is being changed. It's being manipulated in automatic ways, automatic biochemical ways that are it's just predetermined by the previous moment, whether you got hit by a car or not. It determines whether or not your structures do what they do. So because everything is automatic, the things that you're aware of are all automatic. You automatically see what you see, and you couldn't see anything else. You automatically hear what you hear. You couldn't hear anything else. You automatically think what you think. You could not think anything else. You automatically feel what you feel. You could not feel anything else. Because of all of that, really your consciousness isn't you. It's just this sense that you exist. So it's not that that is you. You are all of those things that your consciousness is aware of, including itself, including the awareness itself, if that's what you want to call it. So from my point of view, the reason why yourself isn't this director in consciousness isn't just because consciousness doesn't do that, and it really is just one influence of too many others to really do much of anything. But it's because you really do have a bunch of other features about you that you ignore when you try to act like awareness is the actual you.
Interesting. I think that's a good answer. So for me to answer that question, just from my perspective, in my opinion, if the self didn't exist, I don't think that the conception of consciousness that I have is even possible. Because let's just look at it this way. If you don't have a self that can spatiotemporalize into your three-dimensional body and can interact and influence the different energies and sense them and do something about it, then when you astral project or you leave your body in a DMT state into another dimension, what the hell is interacting with the other discarnate beings there? Well, nothing, it means that the interactions aren't taking place. It means that it's all produced in the brain. If that self isn't true, then nothing I believe holds water. So honestly, the best way to discredit all of my theories I proposed is to prove that this self doesn't exist, because then that is a fundamental core concept of what I believe. And if that's true, that the self doesn't exist like that, then I have to redirect my whole paradigm of my perception of reality, just like Ryan would if he was told that the self did exist in the same way. There are core values in our belief systems that are disparate. So I think that would be the answer to that question from both of our perspectives. Whoever asked that, good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would recommend, specifically to you, Isaac, but to anybody, Sam Harris's book, Free Will. And I think that he puts it the most clearly, the most precisely, and the most inarguably.
Sounds very interesting. If I were to recommend anything to anyone, I would definitely recommend Sacred Knowledge, the book I already brought up earlier, because it's written by a very scientific academic professor, the director of freaking psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. And this guy does great. David Nicholas is good too, but David Nicholas isn't as good as William Richards is. And he points things together like archetypes and stuff a little more fluid and better than I can. But Roger Penrose too, look into him. He's solid. But I need to also look into him because, like we were talking about earlier with the microtubule thing, this is like the fraction that I understand all that stuff. Like, it's very limited. I know it supports my theory, but kind of like string theory, I'm not going into string theory, man. I know it would potentially support my argument, but I'm going to mess my argument up more than I'm going to help it. So this is something you run into with that kind of thing. But yeah, thanks guys for watching. Thanks for your questions. We'll try to get to that stuff in the next video. And Ryan and I will be having future debates in the future. So I hope you guys enjoyed it and liked it. And thank you, Ryan. I think that was better than the first debate we had that is now lost.
Yeah, we're doing good. All right. Thanks, Isaac. Everybody take care.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Ryan Price. Although he can be difficult, that is part of his charm. I really think it gets me in a spirit that conveys my convictions clearly. He appears in 2 other spots on the Lucid Truth podcast. Episode 1, The Needle of Controversy, the old first episode, and episode 13, Consciousness. Where is it? As mentioned at the start of this episode, you can find our other conversations on the Lucid Truth YouTube channel under the Interviews section. You can find the Lucid Truth podcast on our website, thelucidtruth.com, or on Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube. You can support it by sharing it with your friends, donating on Patreon, or following us on your favorite podcatcher. As always, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you for the next episode of The Lucid Truth.